Thanks for listening to me. Um, what you see in front of you is, to replicate the language that we used early in the morning, is a mosaic of traumas. What you see are the badges or the patches of a fair number, most of the volunteer units that self-mobilized in 2015 to serve in the Donbass in Ukraine. Uh, it is also a mosaic of sovereignties, you could argue, because what distinguishes these units is that they attempt to achieve a monopoly of force. They are all distinct armed units that have decided themselves to pick up arms, and they claim in the good of society, Ukrainian nation, something bigger. Ukrainian state, maybe not, although it is a state they would probably want to see, but made in an image they favor, not necessarily an image shared by all these other volunteer units. Now, so I'm going to build on the previous presentation, but I'm going to give it a more negative twist. And I will do that from a military, strategic, and political strategic and operational perspective, and try to explain a bit of what we're seeing at the front lines, why the war has evolved the way it has. And that has a lot to do with these guys over on the whole. Now, the iconography is something that really should be studied much more carefully. That doesn't happen enough for the units. And I don't know what you can quite see is that there are probably the familiar tropes of the Azov battalion, who happen to have in their emblem a symbol that they share with the Waffen-SS division during World War II, the Das Reich division. Now, one shouldn't push these sort of similarities too far. Don't forget that what CMD has in this country as its emblem was also a divisional emblem of the Waffen-SS. The circle with the person, or the triangular thing turned upside down, is a runic sign for death. And CMD, of course, the designer claims never to have had any familiarity with the Waffen-SS. So you have to be careful with drawing too many sort of historical parallels. And the same applies to the black and red that was already mentioned earlier. But the major point to make of this is that when citizens resort to arrogating the right to use force, this can be quite a disruptive political force. And it may not express itself immediately during the war, because all these volunteers were united in their aim of stopping Russian encroachment on the Donbass and overthrowing the then existing Ukrainian state. But it does, and that is one major point to bear in mind, it does present a significant potential political challenge when the war ends, when these political groupings, these politically motivated groupings, are likely to want to have some reward for their service. And the fact that you have so many of these distinct units must be taken as a significant indication that they're not all on the same wavelength politically. Now, let me go into the broader context. Because we're not seeing in Ukraine, even 3 years into the war, the sort of development of how the state takes control over war that we've seen in European history before. Because what you would expect, what many have expected, was a sort of levée en masse, the nation in arms, mobilization of the population, which would be brought, if it wasn't already, under the control of the state. That has not happened. in Ukraine. The state fights with a hybrid army composed of a corps of professional soldiers, a group of conscripts of, I don't want to sound too negative and undiplomatic, but of people of questionable loyalty and motivation, and then a significant group still 3.5 years almost into the war of volunteers who regulate their own recruitment system. And they advertise as units on a market for volunteers who serve with them. Now, whether those people who serve with them are all quite in sync with, well, the ideas of the leadership of these units is open to question to some extent, because you can sort of imagine that you don't really want to serve in a conscript unit with low motivation, given the mortality rates of the front line in the east. Select good volunteer units that have a good reputation. Now, if you take historical precedent and experience of other countries as an indication of how Ukraine should have mobilized, how many men and potentially women as well it should have put in the field, it is falling woefully short of its potential. If you look at the rule of thumb for an effective state mobilizing its people is about 10% of the male population. So if you take the Ukrainian population to be around and about the 40 million, it's probably gone down because of people who have fled and people who live in occupied territory and Russians. If you take 40 million as a rule of thumb, you should see an army of around 4 million men. 4 million men. President Zelensky at the beginning of the year said that the army was around 1 million. Expert estimates put it around 800,000. Expert assessments also say that of those 800,000, only 25% serves on the front line. So you're talking about an army of 200,000, mostly men, who are serving on a front line that is longer than 1,000 kilometers, that stretches from Land's End to whatever it's called up there in Scotland. 200,000 men. Now, if you compare that to operations in the First World War, you compare that with operations in the Second World War, that is painfully thin. Painfully thin. That doesn't give the Ukrainian army much power. Why they survive has largely to do with the relative ineffectiveness of the Russian army. They are not able to capitalize on their numerical superiority. It was mentioned before 4-2-1, I forget which presentation it was, but the Russians on the whole have a numerical superiority on average of 4-1, but they're not able to capitalize on that. Now, I don't want to go into the reasons, so you can ask me about it later, but why the effects of this low mobilization on the Ukrainian side is for the war effort very significant, because it means that although this picture is from 2015, that with those volunteers, with that fragmented popular mobilization and support system, you see that the Ukrainian army side struggles to undertake larger operations. My own estimate is that they couldn't really go much above the company level. Other experts who are far more knowledgeable say it's even lower than that. By the way, it's also shared by the Russian army, that they're operating at a level on the whole that is squad level, which means it's 10 people. Larger operations, company size, 100, battalion size, a few hundred, brigade, well, small brigades in Ukraine, and on the Russian side 1,000, are difficult operations. The volunteers can do that a bit because they have larger units on the whole, but that means, because you've got the fragmented volunteers, the ill-motivated conscripts, the not that highly respected professional element, that organizing major military operations is a challenge too far for the Ukrainian army. And what you see in effect is what you can call a primitivization of war. It becomes what we see, poor squaddies underground in trenches, dying at alarming rates and trying to protect themselves and survive as well. On the Ukrainian side, being fortunate that the Russians are not very good. And it is interesting to note that if you compare this war now with the Second World War or the First World War, we would be at a point early in 1918 or late in 1944. By that time, the armed forces on both the Allied and the German side in World War I had figured out an operational method of how to overcome the enemy, how to break through trench lines, which they practiced in 1918 and ended the war. The Germans just failed. They were too clever. And the British and the French succeeded because they had a simpler approach. World War II, compare this with the Soviet effort in the autumn of 1944. They were deep into Poland. They'd withstood the first attack, and they'd reconquered their territory and more. In the Ukrainian war, neither side has been able to develop an adequate operational approach to dealing with the situation they face at the front, nor do they have the wherewithal to mobilize sufficient manpower to make the attritional warfare, the really simple, primitive warfare, work for their side. Putin is also not mobilizing his country. Other thing that I should have mentioned a bit earlier is the interesting phenomenon of the absence of partisan warfare. This was one of the things that we put high hopes on. To give you context of my background, my military employer at the moment is very interested in whole of society mobilization, and my special forces colleagues are very, very, very interested in partisan warfare, how they can get the civilian population to cooperate with them to make military operations behind enemy front lines impossible. Now, what we see in Ukraine is indeed special operations activity behind Russian front lines, and quite interesting and good in the media activity, but you don't see popular uprisings. It's nothing like the Ukrainian partisans that continued to resist the Soviet state until 1952, 56 possibly even. We don't seem to see that at all. There is some intelligence that is played through to the Ukrainian armed forces, but there isn't a massive network of resistance. What you do see is, though, and it was already hinted at in a previous contribution, and that is something which I don't think we're sufficiently aware of and attuned to, and my military colleagues certainly aren't, and my special forces colleagues aren't at all, is the blurring of the distinction between civilians and military. There is no distinction in Ukraine. Now, I don't want to become too contentious and political, but Bucha has been mentioned quite a few times as sort of the exemplary Russian crime, war crime. Now, one can look at this quite differently from the perspective of the blurring between the civil and the military. There was a very good reconstruction done in the New York Times where they plotted where people were murdered by Russian troops around Bucha. But what you can predict is if these people are ever brought, the Russian soldiers ever brought to trial, is that the defense will focus on military necessity. What they will claim they were doing was they were in a particular military position with the population around them spying on them and phoning through the coordinates of their position. And therefore, whichever civilian got too close, and the poor cyclist that turned the corner was immediately shot. Yeah, because they were wary of civilian people operating as support of military operations. Now, you can say it's ridiculous, and if you look at the biographies of the people who were murdered, you can see that only trigger happy. Went beyond the call of military necessity duty, but they thought, their mindset was, we are now moving to counterinsurgency operations. With the Western unit in the same situation, what are we going to see? I'll leave that an open question. And one can think of the SAS in Afghanistan, Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan, Canadian Special. Yeah, for the older people amongst us, this is a dynamic of conflict that you see in a dramatic fashion in Ukraine. And this is something that we should really be aware of, not to excuse things on the Russian side, but there is, in the end, a logic to this madness. Keep paying attention to this military operational logic that you see, which is fed by a societal makeup that finds it clearly difficult to get mobilized for war. And you were absolutely right in previous presentation to say if you transfer this situation to other countries, it would apply as well. Yeah? Dutch army, no army in Western Europe can recruit enough people just for its professional armed forces. Because society is not interested. Society prefers to remove itself from war. At the end of 2023, so it is a while ago, 750,000 Ukrainian men from between the ages of 18 and 64, so of conscription age, were registered living within the European Union. I have no reason to assume that that number has reduced significantly. The average age of Ukrainian soldiers serving on the front line, has anybody got any idea? I asked my military colleagues, and it hovers around the 43. It seemed to be going down last year, but now it seems to be going back up. 43. Yeah. Compare that to World War II, World War I, where the average age was not that far above 18, 21. So you have a very curious, modern, different from the historical modern pattern of societal support for war. And we can speculate about what the causes for this are. But it is clearly for Ukraine, and I'll wrap up with this, it is a very significant problem because it mobilizes enough people to defeat the Russians on the front line. Societal will, concerted societal will, seems to be absent to do it. Could they do it if they did? Yes, because Putin is clearly dead scared of mobilizing his own population. So does that mean that Putin is going to attack us? Well, he made one strategic mistake in attack in Ukraine. Is he going to make another one? His army is not that good, eh? It's not good. But that doesn't preclude him making mistakes. Okay, I will leave it at that. I hope that that stirs you into making things difficult for me in question time.